This video is about introduction to the motor system, that means spinal cord, initial topic. Our learning objectives include describe the structure of the spinal cord, describe the effects of hemisection of the cord, describe the effects of complete transection of the cord, describe briefly the features of stapes dorsalis and syringomyelia. Okay, so let's start. Sensory information is integrated at all levels of the neuron system or nerve system and causes appropriate motor responses that begin in the spinal cord with relatively simple muscle reflexes, extend into the brainstem from more complicated responses, and finally extend to the cerebrum where the most complicated muscle skills are controlled. In this chapter, we discuss spinal cord control of muscle function. Without the special neuronal circuits of the cord, even the most complex motor control system in the brain could not cause any purposeful muscle movement. For example, there is no neuronal circuit anywhere in the brain that causes the specific to and fro movements of the legs that are required in walking. Instead, the circuits for those movements are in the cord, and the brain simply sends commands or command signals to the spinal cord to set into motion the walking process. Let us now belittle the role of brain. I'm not going to do that. Let us not belittle the role of brain. The brain gives directions that control the sequential cord activities, for example, to promote turning movements when they are required, to lean the body forward during acceleration, to change the movements from walking to jumping as needed, and to monitor continuously and control equilibrium. All this is done through analytical and command signals generated in the brain. However, the many neuronal circuits of the spinal cord that are the objects of the commands are also required. These recruits provide all but a small fraction of the direct control of the muscles. Organization of the spinal cord for motor functions. The cord gray matter is the integrative area for the cord reflexes. Sensory signals enter the cord almost entirely through the sensory roots. Sensory signals through sensory roots, also known as the posterior or dorsal roots. Sensory roots or posterior or dorsal roots. After entering the cord, every sensory signal travels to two separate destinations. One branch of the sensory nerve terminates almost immediately in the gray matter and the cord and elicits local segments, cord reflexes, and other local effects, and other branch transmits signals to the high levels of the nerve system, that is, higher levels of the cord itself, to the brainstem or even to the cerebral cortex. Each segment of the spinal cord at the level of each spinal nerve has several million neurons in this gray matter. Aside from the sensory relay neurons, the other neurons of two types, anterior motor neurons and interneurons. We need to learn about connections of the peripheral sensory fibers and corticospinal fibers in the interneurons and anterior motor neurons of the spinal cord. You can see regions like solitary cell, sensory root, external basal cells, corticospinal tract, interneurons, and anterior motor neurons. And peripheral sensory fibers and anterior motor neurons in innervating skeletal muscle, peripheral horn, intermediate zone, dorsal root ganglion, presenting fibers, anterior horn, gamma root motor neuron, alpha motor neuron, motor end plate, 1A fiber, 1B fiber, Golgi tendon organ, muscle spindle, and skeletal muscle, etc. connected. Anterior motor neurons. Located in each segment of the anterior horns of the cord gray matter are several thousand neurons that are 50 to 100% longer than most of the others and longer or larger than most of the others, and is called anterior motor neurons. They give rise to the nerve fibers that leave the cord by way of the anterior roots and directly innervates the skeletal muscle fibers. The neurons are of two types, alpha motor neurons and gamma motor neurons, not beta, gamma. Alpha motor neurons. The alpha motor neurons give rise to large type 1 alpha or A alpha in particular. A alpha motor nerve fibers arriving 14 mm in diameter. These fibers branch many times after they enter the muscle and innervate the large skeletal muscle fibers. Stimulation of a single alpha nerve fiber excites anywhere from 3 to several hundred skeletal muscle fibers, which are collectively called the motor unit. motor unit. Transmission of nerve impulses into skeletal muscles and their stimulation of the muscle motor units are very important. Then gamma motor neurons. Along with the alpha motor neurons, which excite contraction of the skeletal muscle fibers, about one half of many much smaller gamma motor neurons are located in the spinal cord anterior horns. These gamma motor neurons transmit impulses through much smaller type of gamma motor nerve fibers averaging 5 mm in diameter, which go to small special skeletal muscle fibers called intrafacial fibers or intrafusal fibers. Intrafusal fibers. These fibers constitute the middle of the muscle spindle, which helps control the basic muscle tone. Then interneurons. Interneurons are present in all areas of cold gray matter. In the dorsal horns, the anterior horns, and the intermediate areas between them. The cells are about 30 times as numerous as the anterior motor neurons. They are small and highly excitable, often exhibiting spontaneous activity and capable of firing as rapidly as 1500 times per second. They have many interconnections with one another, and many of them also synapse directly with the anterior motor neurons. The interconnections among the interneurons and posterior motor neurons are responsible for most of the integrative functions of the spinal cord. Then essentially all the different types of neuronal circuits are found in the interneuron pool of the cells of the spinal cord, including diverging, converging, repetitive discharge, and other types of circuits. In this chapter, we examine many applications of these different circuits in the performance of specific reflex actions by the spinal cord. Only a few incoming sensory signals from the spinal nerves or signals from the brain terminate directly in the anterior motor neurons. Instead, almost all the signals are transmitted first through interneurons when they are appropriately proceeded. Thus, the corticospinal tract from the brain is shown and terminate almost entirely on spinal interneurons, where the signals from the tract are combined with signals from other spinal signal tracts and spinal nerves before finally converging on the anterior motor neurons to control muscle function. Essentially, all the different types of neuronal circuits are found in the interneuron pool of the cells of the spinal cord. Then Renshaw cells transmit, RENSHAW cells transmit inhibitory signals to surrounding motor neurons, also located in the anterior horns of the spinal cord. In close association with the motor neurons are a large number of small neurons called Renshaw cells. Almost immediately after the anterior motor neuron axon leaves the body of the neuron, collateral branches from the axon pass to adjacent Renshaw cells. Renshaw cells are inhibitory cells that transmit inhibitory signals to surrounding motor neurons. This stimulation of each motor neuron tends to inhibit adjacent motor neurons, an effect called lateral inhibition. Lateral inhibition will be taking place. This effect is important for the following major reasons. The motor system uses this lateral inhibition to focus to sharpen its signals in same way that sensory system uses the same principle to allow unabated transmission of the primary signal in the desired direction while suppressing the tendency of signals to spread laterally. Then multi-segmental connections from one spinal cord level to another level. Propriospinal fibers. More than half of all the nerve fibers that ascend and descend in the spinal cord are propriospinal fibers. These fibers run from one segment of the cord to another. In addition, as the sensory fibers enter the cord from posterior cord roots, they bifurcate and branch both up and down the spinal cord. Some of the branches transmit signals to only a segment or two, whereas others transmit signals to many segments. These ascending and descending propriospinal fibers of the cord provide pathways for the multi-segmental reflexes described later. Autonomous reflexes in the spinal cord. Some types of segmental autonomic reflexes are integrated in the spinal cord, most of which are discussed. These reflexes are changes in vascular tone resulting from changes in local skin heat, sweating, which results from localized heat on the surface of the body, intestinal reflexes, intestinal reflexes that control some motor functions of the gut, then peritoneointestinal reflexes that inhibit gastrointestinal motility in response to peritoneal irritation, evacuation reflexes for emptying the full bladder or the colon. In addition, all the segmental reflexes can at times be elicited simultaneously in the form of the so-called mass reflex. What is a mass reflex? In a spinal animal or human being, sometimes the spinal cord suddenly becomes extensively active, causing massive discharge in large portions of cord. The usual stimulus that causes this excess activity is a strong pain stimulus to the skin or excessive filling of a viscous, such as overdistension of the bladder or the gut. Regardless of the type of stimulus, the resulting reflex is called a mass reflex. Involve large portions of even all of the cord. These effects are the following: a major portion of the body's skeletal muscles goes into strong flexure spasm. The colon and bladder are likely to evacuate. The arterial pressure often rises to maximal value, sometimes a systolic pressure well over 200 mmHg, and large areas of body break out into profuse sweating. Because of the mass reflex can last for minutes, it presumably results from activation of a great number of overbearing circuits and excite large areas of cord at once. This mechanism is similar to the mechanism of epileptic seizures, which involve overbearing circuits that occur in the brain instead of the cord. That is mass reflex phenomenon. Then spinal cord transection and spinal shock, a medical application of this topic about spinal cord. Well, the spinal cord is suddenly transected in the upper neck. At first, essentially all cord functions, including the cord reflexes, immediately become depressed to the point of total silence, a reaction called spinal shock. The reason for this reaction is that normal activity of the cord neurons depend on a great extent on continual tonic excitation of the discharge of nerve fibers entering the cord from higher centers, particularly discharge transmitted through the reticulospinal tracts, vestibulospinal tracts, and corticospinal tract. Reticulospinal tract, ventriculospinal tract, and corticospinal tract. After a few hours to a few weeks, the spinal neurons gradually regain their excitability. There seems to be a natural characteristic of neurons everywhere in the nerve system, that is, after they lose their source of facilitatory impulses, they increase their own natural degree of excitability to make up at least partially for the loss. In many non-primates, excitability of the cord centers returns essentially to normal within a few hours to a day or so. In human beings, the return is often delayed for several weeks and occasionally is never complete. Conversely, sometimes recovery is excessive with resultant hyper excitability of some or all functions. Nevertheless, the recovery of reflex is insufficient to bear the weight of a person, and hence it is not possible to stand unsupported. In terms of postural reflexes, this is the feature of the so-called spinal alignment. Some of the spinal functions specifically affected during or after spinal shock are the following. At onset of spinal shock, the arterial blood pressure falls almost instantly and drastically, sometimes to as low as 40 mmHg, thus demonstrating that sympathetic nerve system activity becomes blocked almost to extinction. The pressure ordinarily returns to normal within a few days, even in human beings. At onset of spinal shock, the arterial blood pressure falls almost instantly and drastically. The next, all skeletal muscle reflexes integrated in the spinal cord are blocked during the initial stages of shock. In lower animals, a few hours to a few days are required for these reflexes to return to normal. In human beings, 2 weeks to several months are sometimes required. In both animals and humans, some reflexes may eventually become hyperexcitable, particularly if a few facilitatory pathways remain intact between the brain and the cord, while the remainder of the spinal cord is transected. The first reflex to return are the structure reflexes, followed in order by the progressively more complex reflexes, flexure reflexes, postural anti-gravity reflexes, and remnants of stepping reflexes. The sacral reflexes, control of bladder and colon evacuation, are suppressed in human beings for the first few weeks after cord transection, but in most cases they eventually return. Then hemisection of the cord. A hemisection of the cord, that is transection of half the cord on any one side, can occur due to injury or an expanding tumor of the cord and leads to a unique set of signs in the patient. These are the ipsilateral on the same side of the lesion upper motor neuron paralysis below that lesion due to interruption of the corticospinal tract, which supplies the anterior horn motor cells to cells on the same side below that level. It may also be possible to demonstrate a lower motor neuron paralysis ipsilaterally at the level of lesion. There is also a loss of superficial reflexes and loss of proprioception, 2-point discrimination, and vibratory sense epileptically due to interruption of the posterior white column. However, pain and temperature sensation is lost on the opposite side below the lesion due to interruption of the anterior lateral spinothalamic tract, whose fibers originate on the side opposite the lesion but which crossed in the anterior white commissure. This presentation is also called a Brown-Séquard syndrome. Tapes dorsalis. Tapes dorsalis is the disorder of the spinal cord due to demyelination of the dorsal columns. These columns carry the sensation of fine touch, vibration, and position. The condition occurs as a result of untreated syphilis and is quite rare presently. There is a condition decreased tone of muscle with diminished tendon reflexes, a loss of coordination, and a characteristic high stepping gait, while the patient is unable to sense the position of the foot in relation to the ground while stepping. Then, syringomyelia. Syringomyelia is another disorder of the spinal cord due to the formation of a fluid-filled cavity in the central cord. This expanding cavity in the center of the cord puts pressure particularly in nerves that cross that point, which is the afferent nerves carrying the pain and temperature sensations of the anterior lateral tract. The primary symptom is therefore a loss of thermal and crude pain sensations. The cavity or cyst can be congenital or acquired due to trauma or infection, and it is also called a syrinx.